Now we're moving on to the second of the Muslim gunpowder empires, the Safavid Empire, which remember is smack dab in the middle between the two other Muslim gunpowder empires. Now, all three of these empires are Muslim, but they're different types of Islamic branches. The Ottoman Empire is majority Sunni, and their religious leader is a caliph. Okay, but following the split between the Sunni and the Shia, the Sunni continue to have a caliph as their religious leader, whereas the Shia followed their imam. Okay, so you have two religious leaders, kind of like with Christianity, where the Catholics had the Pope and the Eastern Orthodox had the patriarch. You have the same thing happen in Islam. The Sunni follow the caliph, the Shia follow the imam. Same thing is going to happen politically. The political leader of the Ottoman Empire is a sultan. The political leader for the Safavid is a shah. It's important to know the difference between these titles. It would kind of be like if you called Louis XIV the Tsar. It's like, no, he's a king, not a Tsar. You got to keep track of what are these titles for their rulers. Okay, does that make sense so far? Now, the Safavid Empire is the shortest lived of these Muslim gunpowder empires. And there's a number of reasons why. They had a litany, and a litany is a long list. They had a litany of problems, okay? Geographically, they are smack dab in the middle of two expanding empires. The Ottoman Empire is getting bigger, and the Mughal Empire is getting bigger. And so as a result, they're moving into Safavid territory. Also, the Safavid Empire lacks geographic barriers. Okay, they lack geographic protections or natural defenses that would allow them to stave off invasion. In the Ottoman Empire, their capital of Istanbul is very well protected. It has fortifications, but also has natural defenses like being on the water, so they can see attacks coming from any direction. The Safavid Empire does not have those geographic benefits for natural defenses. They also lacked a navy, okay? Even though they have access to maritime routes like the Caspian Sea and the Arabian Sea, they are going to fail to modernize quickly enough to build a strong navy, and that is going to put them at a military disadvantage. As well as early on, they're going to shun gunpowder weaponry as unmanly and unreliable, which also gets their butts kicked in a battle against the Ottoman Empire, which had embraced gunpowder weaponry. Lastly, but very significantly, the Safavid Empire was not religiously tolerant. Okay, the Safavid Empire wanted everyone to be Shia, a specific branch of Shiism known as Twelver Shiism. And so they are going to oppress all other religious groups, ultimately leading to revolution and rebellion, particularly with the Sunni Pashtun, who end up sieging the capital of Isfahan and eventually overthrowing the empire. So whereas the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire were chill when it came to religion, the Safavid Empire was decidedly not chill. These are all factors that led to the decline of the Safavid Empire. But one of the most important factors that contributed to its decline was its lack of religious toleration. They were very, very strictly Shia. Okay, and under their founder, they're going to be a part of a very strict and extremist form of Shiism. Okay, that's going to be problematic for the empire. Whereas the Ottoman Empire was religiously tolerant and said, hey, Christians, Jewish people, Zoroastrians, whatever you want to be, you can be it as long as you pay your taxes. Okay, the Safavid Empire, in contrast, is going to be like, you've got to be our religion or we'll kill you to death until you die. Okay, so persecution of anyone who's not the majority religion of the empire. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so how did the Safavid Empire come to be? Well, its founder was Shah Ismail. Okay, now Ishmael had been kicked out of his empire at age 7 in 1499, but he hadn't been killed. His followers protect him. He ends up living in the swamps, Shrek style, from ages 7 until 12, until he's able to raise up a big enough army to go back to his homeland, get revenge, and take the throne. Where else have we seen this in world history, where someone was kicked from their homeland and then they came back with an army and ruled an empire? The Lion King, good, Sundiata of the Empire of Mali in Africa. Okay, so a similarity there. Now, Shah Ismail settled the Safavid Empire in what is modern day Iran. Okay, Iran is going to continue to have a continuity of Shia Muslim beliefs, and he is going to establish the Safavid Empire. Now, the particular branch of Shiism that he's going to establish is known as Twelver Shiism. Y'all may have noticed that I have the notes typed over here instead of handwritten, okay, so you can read them more easily. These are notes that you need to have in your notes. Okay, so if you're looking for spelling or the words that I'm saying, they're all right here. So Shah Ismail is going to institute the religious beliefs of Twelver Shiism. Now, y'all may remember that when the Prophet Muhammad started Islam in 622, he was the last prophet. There are not supposed to be any other prophets after him, right? So who's supposed to be the military and religious leader for the Ummah, for Islam, once the prophet's dead? Okay, well, after Muhammad's death, there was a conflict over who was supposed to be in charge. The Sunni believed that any member of the Ummah, spell of, come on, could be caliph, whereas the Shia believed that caliph must be related to prophet by blood. So this was an early schism in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia. Okay, so then we had the 4 rightly guided caliphs. The first 3 were Sunni. They were not related to the prophet by blood. They were related to him by marriage, like his father-in-law or his cousin-in-law, or that one of them was his best friend, but they weren't related to him physically by blood. The 4th rightly guided caliph was Ali, and he was Shia. He was related to the prophet. There was a direct bloodline to the prophet. But remember that most of these rightly guided caliphs were assassinated. Okay, so this is going to be an ongoing conflict, a continuity, if you will, throughout the Middle East, the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia. So after the 4 rightly guided caliphs, that only solidified the split between these 2 branches. The Sunni continued having caliphs lead them, okay, like in the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty, and the Shia established the position of imam for their religious leaders. Remember that there is a Venn diagram worksheet in the folder in Schoology for this unit. You're supposed to be comparing and contrasting these empires as we go along. This is a big difference, okay? Similarly, they're both Muslim. In terms of difference, they're different branches of Islam, kind of like in the split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. In the Catholic Church, the Pope was the leader. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Patriarch was the leader. We see the same thing happening with the Sunni and the Shia. Okay. Another difference is that the Sunni in the Ottoman Empire were led by a sultan. Okay, the Shia in the Safavid Empire were led by a Shah. Okay, kind of like the person leading France was a king. The person leading Russia was a czar. Okay, different terms for their political leaders. The Ottomans were sultans. The Safavid were shahs. The Mughals were emperors. The Russians were czars. The English were kings and queens, etc., etc. Okay, also different terms for religious leaders. In the Ottoman Empire, the caliph was the religious leader because they're Sunni. In the Safavid Empire, the imam was the religious leader because they're Shia. In the Catholic Church, the Pope is the leader. In the Orthodox Church, the Patriarch is the leader. So it's important for you to keep track of these different terms and what they mean. Because if you start saying things like, oh, Shah Suleiman the Magnificent, it's like, no, he wasn't a Shah, he was a Sultan. Or if you say Sultan, Abbas the Great, no, he wasn't a sultan, he was a Shah. It's important to make those distinctions, okay? So in 12er Shi'ism, they had imams. They believed that the descendants of the prophet should lead the Ummah, and that there were 12 descendants of the prophet Muhammad, and that each of these 12 descendants, each of these 12 imams were infallible. Okay, what does it mean to be infallible? You make no mistakes. Good. Now, are we infallible? Nope. I am very fallible. I don't know about y'all, but I make at least 10 mistakes before I even leave the house in the morning. Okay, it's like, I messed up with my winged eyeliner. So yeah, we're very fallible. But according to 12er Shi'ism, these imams were infallible. They could never be wrong. Now, the 12th imam, or the hidden imam, was supposedly Shah Ismail. But he went even further with this branch of Shi'ism. In the conventional form of 12er Shi'ism, yes, there were imams and they were led by God, but they weren't actually God. Shah Ismail is going to change that by saying, actually, as the 12th imam, I'm God in the flesh. I am a reincarnation of Allah. Now, this is going to be a big issue for the Sunni, because this is going very dangerously close towards heresy, saying that this dude is the one true God and he's a human and he's infallible. Okay, that's kind of like with the whole Christianity thing with Jesus. The Muslims didn't believe that Jesus was the actual son of God or God in the flesh. They believed he was a prophet like Muhammad. Muhammad never claimed to be a God. He was simply a prophet for the one true God. This guy, Ishmael, is claiming, no, actually, I'm God himself and I'm never wrong. Okay, so his followers are going to be very devout and very loyal because they're like, yeah, I'm not going to go against God. Okay, but this is going to lead to some religious conflict because there are going to be a lot of people who are like, yeah, you can't just go around saying that's your God. That's kind of like not cool, dude. Does that make sense so far? All right. So how did we get this type of extreme 12er Shi'ism? Well, the Safavid Empire traces its heritage back not to Sunnism, but to Sufism. Okay, y'all may remember that Sufism is a syncretic religion combining Islam and Hinduism. And in this particular branch of Islam, they condemned material wealth. They said, we need to move away from focusing on worldly possessions, and we need to focus on following Allah. And we can have a personal relationship with the one true God. Well, under 12er Shi'ism, doesn't get any more personal than you actually being able to see God in the flesh. So they're going to take this Sufi idea of, hey, you need to dedicate your life to Allah and have a personal relationship with Allah, to, hey, this guy is literally Allah. Now, the particular Sufi branch that originated in Iraq and Iran is traced back to a leader known as Safi al-Din. And so the Safavid Empire is going to trace their heritage back to this Sufi mystic. And that's where we're going to get the name for the Safavid Empire. Safi al-Din turns into Safavid, similar to how Osman Bey, okay, Osman turns into Ottoman. Okay, so we see the heritage link there. And so it's from this that we get 12er Shi'ism. So since their leader, the Shah, is claiming that he's God, and he holds both political and religious power, this makes the Safavid Empire a theocracy. There is no separation between church and state. They are one and the same. He is the political leader, and he's also the religious leader. He's not a sultan, he's not an emperor, he is a Shah. That is the name for their ruler. And he is going to build up the Safavid Empire as a gunpowder empire. They are going to have gunpowder weapons. However, they're not going to rely very heavily on those gunpowder weapons, which is going to be a problem, especially when they go up against other gunpowder empires, and they're going to come up short in that battle. Now, as a god on earth, Ishmael is going to be very strict about enforcing religious ideals. He's going to say, you have to be my religion. If you're in my empire, you have to believe that I am the 12th Imam and the incarnation of Allah. Now, the Sunni Muslims and other religious branches within that territory are going to be like, yeah, no, thank you. And so he's going to persecute anyone who is not his religion. This is one of the big differences between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. The Ottoman Empire was really chill when it came to religion. It's like, yeah, you can be Christian or Jewish or whatever, Zoroastrianism, as long as you pay your taxes, the jizya. But in the Safavid Empire, there is one choice. You are Shia. If you're not Shia, then you're dead. Okay, so that's going to lead to internal conflict, as people who are oppressed tend to not like being oppressed. And it's going to lead to external conflict, as the Ottoman Empire next door, which is majority Sunni, is going to have a big problem with this persecution of fellow Sunnis in the Safavid Empire. Are we good so far? All right. So remember that under 12 Shiism, they believed that there were descendants of the prophets, of the prophet Muhammad, and that these were the 12 Imams, and that Ishmael was the 12th hidden Imam, but also the incarnation of Allah himself. Now, the followers of Ishmael were known as the Qizilbash, Qizilbash. This is one of your vocabulary terms for this unit. They were called the Qizilbash because in that language, in that dialect, they were known as redheads. The reason they were called redheads was because of the distinctive hats that they wore. These hats were bright red and they had 12 pleats, okay, representing the 12 Imams that form up the belief system of 12er Shiism. And this isn't unusual to associate political rulers with divinity or with religion. Okay, we see this early on in Islam. Okay, the prophet wasn't a god, but he was a religious and a political leader. He was kicked out of Mecca in 622. He fled to Yathrib, which later became known as Medina, or the city of the prophet. He raised an army, and then he took that army back to Mecca to conquer it for the one true God. And when we look at the caliphs that followed him, they also raised and led armies in the name of Allah. Osman Bey, he incorporated the ideal of the Ghazi ideal, being a warrior for Islam or a sword of Allah. So this isn't strange to see this connection with between the political and the religious and the military. Okay, this is a common trend throughout these empires. Are we good so far? Now, as an infallible imam, okay, Ishmael is going to go to war against the Ottoman Empire. And he's going to tell everybody, we're going to win. Okay, because are gods in the habit of, losing wars? No, okay, they tend to win wars. It's kind of part of being all powerful and all knowing. But is the Safavid Empire going to win this war against the Ottomans? No, they are not, because their military elite at the time, the Qizilbash, they are very loyal to the Shah because they believe he's God, but they are bringing swords to a gunfight, and that's not going to end well for them. So in 1514, the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire square up, and the Ottomans are going to win. The reason for this is that the Ottomans have a much more advanced army with more gunpowder technology. Y'all may remember that Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent expanded the Devshirme system in the 15th and 16th centuries. In that Devshirme system, I gotta spell it out. In that Devshirme system, who was captured and converted to Islam and raised to speak Turkish and raised to go into the military or into the government? Where did they pull this population from? The sons of Christian families. Good. Christian families in the Balkans, okay, Eastern Europe. So the Ottoman Empire had conquered Eastern Europe in 1453, all of that jazz. So they move into the Balkans. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent says, we need a modern army. Let's start collecting boys from ages 8 to 20 from these Balkan lands and then raising them to go into the government, maybe as viziers or other bureaucrats, or they could enter into the military. What was the group of coerced labor that went into the military section of the Devshirme called? What do we call those soldiers? Janissaries. Okay, good. The Ottoman soldiers from the Devshirme system were known as Janissaries, and they were outfitted with modern gunpowder technology. Okay, in contrast, the Safavid Ghulams are going to see firearms as unreliable and unmanly, which is kind of interesting seeing how that perspective has changed over time. Like if someone asked you, like, what are guns today? You know, unmanly or unreliable may not be like one of the first things that they say because of the whole like macho persona with firearms. But back then, the Safavid Empire was like, yeah, no, that's weak. Okay, you can miss me with that. Okay, unfortunately, they were wrong in their assessment of how well they were going to do in this battle because the Janissaries had so many guns. So the Safavid Empire is going to take a huge L. Okay, this is going to be a devastating defeat. They're going to have a ton of people die. Their Shah flees the battle. He survives. He's not captured. But can he go around claiming that he's God anymore? No, this is really going to hurt his credibility. Just like with the Crusades with the Pope. The Pope says, God told me to go to Jerusalem and reconquer it, and then they failed to conquer Jerusalem. Like, this is not a good look. So Ishmael is going to escape. He's no longer going to be able to claim that he's God anymore. And the Safavid Empire is down, but not out. They are badly, badly damaged. Okay, but they're not completely destroyed. However, this is going to be a continuity over time, this conflict between the two branches of Islam. The conflict between the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire is going to continue for the next 200 years until the Safavid Empire is finally overthrown by the Sunni Pashtuns. Okay, so the Sunni-Shia conflict is a continuity throughout period 2, period 3, and period 4, all the way up until today, with Iran being predominantly Shia and Iraq being predominantly Sunni. Okay, so this is a continuity that goes across time periods, just like Confucianism goes across time periods for China, just like serfdom goes across time periods for Russia. Okay, the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia is going to encompass all of the time periods in this curriculum. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So clearly the Ghulams are going to be defeated when they go up against the Ottoman Empire. And the Ghulams are the protectors of the Shahs. Okay, so after this battle, we're going to see that they're largely obsolete. Okay, and they're going to need to be replaced in the military. And so that's where we're going to see the Safavid Empire copy the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire has the Devshirme system with Janissaries. The Safavid Empire under Abbas the Great is going to establish the Ghulam system, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. First, we're going to talk about the role of the patriarchy in this empire. Now, y'all may remember when we talked about the Ottoman Empire, all of the leaders were men, okay? But there was an area in which women could play a political and social role in the courts, okay? How did women in the Ottoman Empire exert their influence over the government in society? In the Ottoman Empire, how did women play a role in politics? Harem politics, exactly right. They couldn't rule directly, but they could have the heir. They could have the next sultan in line to the throne. So they would play political and social roles at court in order to promote their own children to one day take the throne. You have multiple examples of that. The most famous example being Roxolana, the favorite concubine of the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. In contrast, in the Safavid Empire, we don't really see a big role for women in politics. And when women do end up getting positions of power in the Safavid Empire, it gets very, very dangerous for them. Okay, for instance, the wife of one of the Shahs, okay, the wife of Shah Qajar by the name of Mahdi Ola, she was the de facto ruler. Her husband, Qajar, was the literal ruler. He was officially the Shah, but he wasn't really good at ruling, and he kind of just let her do whatever she wanted. So she was the de facto ruler. Well, as the Qizilbash, the noble military men, okay, that were higher up in society, did not like the fact that there was a woman calling the shots in their empire. And so they killed her to death until she died. She was assassinated for the crime of being a woman with power. So in contrast to the Ottoman Empire, we see very small or very few examples of women in politics. Are we good so far? But the Qizilbash are really on their way out. They're obsolete. They're not modern. And the Safavid Empire is gonna have to modernize, as demonstrated by their devastating loss in the Battle of Chalderon. So why was the Battle of Chalderon historically significant? Hint, hint, wink, wink. Okay, historical significance of this event in history in 1514. Well, it showed that you need to modernize with gunpowder technology. If you're going to be a land-based empire like Russia or the Ottoman Empire, you can't just rely on swords and knives. You need gunpowder tech. This is also going to limit the influence of the Shia branch of Islam. Sunnis are going to dominate in the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to be more common in the Mughal Empire than the Shia. The Shia is going to remain a much smaller branch of Islam, even up until today. Another effect of the loss of this battle is that Ishmael can't claim that he's a god, and so his successors, the Shahs who come after him, also cannot claim to be a god. Okay, so they shift over to a less extreme form of Twelver Shiism. Yes, they're still going to be Shia. They still believe that the leader should be related to the prophet through the bloodline. Okay, but they're not going to make claims that Allah is reincarnated on earth. Okay, but now Ishmael doesn't have the loyalty of the Qizilbash based on religion. When he was claiming to be God, like, yeah, they would fight for him to the death and do anything for him because they're like, yeah, he's God, he's infallible. But after this battle, he can't keep claiming, hey, I'm a all-powerful being on earth. He has to get them to follow him through another means. So when you can't use religion, you can use money. So in order to maintain the loyalty of the Qizilbash, Ishmael and other Shahs start issuing land grants, okay, to keep them under their rule. So similar to what we see in feudalism in Europe, the king has a lot of land, gives it to his vassals, thus the vassals are loyal to the king. So since he can no longer claim he's a god, he has to give them something that will be an incentive for them to continue to support his rule, even though he just got severely embarrassed at this Battle of Chalderon. Does that make sense so far? The historical significance? Okay, the historical significance of the Battle of Chalderon is that you have to modernize. The Safavid Empire realizes we can't keep bringing swords to a gunfight. The Qizilbash are obsolete. We need a stronger, more modern military. Ishmael can't claim to be God anymore. So if we want to maintain control over this empire, we're going to have to give them a monetary incentive. We're going to have to start giving them land instead of just saying, hey, I'm infallible. You need to listen to me because I said so. Does that make sense? Excellent. So after Shah Ishmael, we're going to have a series of Shahs, but they're no longer going to claim that they are God. And one of these Shahs is actually going to build up the Safavid Empire to its peak. And that's going to be Shah Abbas the First, or also known as Abbas the Great. So you can assume he did some pretty cool stuff. He is the Safavid equivalent of the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent from the Ottoman Empire. Y'all may remember that under the Ottoman Empire, okay, they hit their peak under Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent expanded the Devshirme system. He built a lot of infrastructure. He expanded the empire. It was only after Suleiman the Magnificent's death that the Ottoman Empire starts its slow and steady decline. Okay, so Shah Abbas is going to be that equivalent. He is going to revitalize the Safavid Empire, build new infrastructure, palaces, and mosques. He's going to move the capital to Isfahan, which is closer to those land routes for trade, which is going to benefit the economy of the Safavid Empire. But like the sultans in the Ottoman Empire, he's also going to have a dark side. Y'all may remember that there's a lot of palace intrigue in the Ottoman Empire, and the sultans were allowed to assassinate all of their brothers once they took the throne because they were threats to their power. Well, Shah Abbas is also going to be very paranoid when it comes to threats to his power. He's going to imprison his own sons to keep an eye on them, to make sure they don't murder him so they can take his throne. And he's even going to blind and kill family members that he perceives as threats to his rule. So even though he's going to revitalize the Safavid Empire, okay, he did have some flaws and some issues. It must be difficult being the Shah when you're afraid that everybody is going to kill you to death. Are we good so far? One of the ways that he copied the Ottoman Empire is that, like the Ottoman Empire, he started a system of coerced labor for the military. Clearly, the Qizilbash are not enough. They are obsolete. We got defeated at the Battle of Chalderon in 1514. So now we need to change. So Abbas the Great is going to establish his own slave infantry system. Okay, these are known as the Ghulams, or the slaves of the royal household. Whereas the Ottomans would conquer Christian boys from the Balkans, the Safavid are going to capture Christian boys from Russia, because remember, Russia is right above Persia. So they capture these boys, they raise them to be Muslim, they learn how to speak Turkish, and then they train them as military men. And they are going to be outfitted with gunpowder technology. Okay, so Shah Abbas learned the lesson of the Battle of Chalderon. So this is historically significant because it shows a global trend. Okay, it's not just the Ottomans who have a professional army. It's also the Safavid. It's also the Mughal. It's also the Russians. It's also the French. We see a global trend towards professional armies. We're moving away from, oh, feudalism, let's call up our vassals and see if they can send us a few serfs with pointy sticks. Now we start moving towards a trained military, okay, in their conflicts. So when we talk about that, the trained military for the Ottomans were the Janissaries. The trained military for the Safavid were the Ghulams. The trained military for the Mughals were the zamindar system, or the zamindari system. Okay, so a move towards professional armies. In Russia, Peter the Great established a meritocracy with the table of ranks. In the absolute monarchies of Europe, okay, like with Louis XIV, they moved away from feudalistic labor for their military and towards professional standing armies. That's what enabled them to maintain their absolute rule in their constant power struggle with the nobles. Okay, so this is very important. If you're doing an SAQ, okay, and it was talking about what is one change over blah, blah, blah. You could say there was a global trend towards professional armies. You'd have to give specific factual evidence that backs up that claim. The Janissaries, Ghulams, Zamindar. Would the Oprichnina be similar to the Janissaries and Ghulams? Yeah, I would say that that's a good comparison because they are the secret police of the Tsar. So the Janissaries are ultra loyal to the Sultan. The Ghulams are the slaves of the royal household, so they're loyal to the Shah. So I would say that's a very good complex connection, that the Oprichnina are similar to that due to their loyalty to the absolute ruler of their empire. That's a very good point. Okay. Also, in terms of global trends, while we have a global trend as we move into period 3 towards professional armies, we also see as we move into period 3 a trend away from slavery and forced labor. Y'all may remember in 1861 with the Emancipation Act, the Russians ended serfdom after the Crimean War. In 1865, the United States ended slavery. In 1888, Brazil ended slavery as well. In the 1700s, the Janissaries overthrew the Sultanate and ended the Devshirme system. So as we move into the modern age, okay, as we go into period 3 and then into period 4, we see a global trend away from slave labor and a global trend towards professional armies. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So Abbas is going to modernize the army, revitalize the Safavid Empire, and he is going to reclaim the land that the Ottomans had taken from them back in the Battle of Chalderon. So they increased the amount of gunpowder weapons that they had. However, they are still going to have some flaws that lead to the decline of their empire. Okay, they're able to reach their peak under Abbas the Great, and he does revitalize the empire and increase their gunpowder weapons and increase their infrastructure and take back territory. However, he is still going to be religiously intolerant. Okay, he is going to be a very, very strict adherent to Shia Islam. Not necessarily the 12er Shia Islam where he's a god, but he is going to actively persecute the Sunnis. And this is not going to be a good look when their neighbors, the Ottomans, are majority Sunni. So this is going to be a continuity, this conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavid, as Abbas the Great tries to eradicate the Sunnis from his empire, forcing conversions to his particular branch of Islam, whereas the Ottomans were like, you can be whatever you want as long as you pay taxes. So this is going to cause internal conflict with rebellions by oppressed peoples, and it's going to lead to external conflicts, as the Ottoman Empire, majority Sunni, is not going to be a big fan of these policies by the Safavid. Is everyone good on this slide? So this isn't just a continuity within periods 2 and 3. This is a continuity that goes from the beginning of Islam in 1622 in period 1 all the way up into the modern age. So this is a continuity that covers all 4 of the time periods that we cover in this curriculum. And it's going to define some of the boundaries and the countries that we see in the Middle East today. For instance, Iran is going to be predominantly Shia. Iraq is going to be predominantly Sunni. And we see that the majority of the Ummah, okay, leans towards the Sunni branch as opposed to the Shia branch. But this traces all the way back to the Prophet. When he died, who's supposed to be in charge? That led to the split, the schism, like what we saw in Christianity. And then that's going to continue and continue to be violent, okay? Just like with the wars of religion in Europe. There's going to be a lot of deaths between the same religions over these minute differences. Last we left off, we were talking about the Ottoman and the Safavid conflict. Y'all may remember that in 1514, there was a big battle between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Okay, what was that battle known as? Starts with a C. Good, the Battle of Chalderon. Okay, now who won that battle? The Ottoman Empire did. Why did the Ottoman Empire win that battle? What advantage did they have militarily? Exactly right. They had gunpowder weaponry, specifically wielded by elite military forces. And what were the names of that elite military force? Janissaries. Okay, good. The Janissaries were Christian boys from the Balkans who were taken from ages 8 to 20, raised in the Devshirme system to either be a bureaucrat like a vizier or to become a soldier for the Sultan. Okay, and so they have military elite outfitted with gunpowder weapons, and the Safavid felt that guns were unreliable and unmanly. Okay, and so they're going to be at a disadvantage because they're not as modernized as the Ottoman Empire. After the Battle of Chalderon, they're going to have to make some changes. Number one change is that their leader, Ishmael, can't go around claiming to be a god. Okay, he can't go around saying, I'm the incarnation of Allah. Okay, because gods aren't really in the habit of losing battles. It's kind of not their thing. So that wasn't really, on mark for Ishmael. And also with this, we see a continuity between these two empires. The Sunni and Shia conflict is going to be a historical continuity even up until the present day. Okay, so there are still conflicts between the modern countries of Iraq and Iran as it relates to which branch of Islam they adhere to. Now, the Ottoman Empire was religiously tolerant. Okay, they had millets or autonomous communities where people could be independent and keep their cultures and keep their traditions, right? They just had to pay the jizya, the tax. The Safavid Empire is going to be the opposite. They are not going to be religiously tolerant. And that's going to be one of the contributing factors in their decline. Okay, religious toleration can make an empire last longer, because are people going to rebel if they get to live their lives the way they want? No, they rebel as oppression increases. And the Safavid are going to increase their oppression of the Sunnis in particular within their empire, which their neighbors, the Ottomans, are not going to be too chill about. Are we good so far? All right. So as the Safavid Empire expands, we know that the Shah can't be everywhere. Okay, he's not going to be able to rule over everything exactly. So he's going to have to make sure that there are local leaders that report back to him that are loyal to him. And typically, in order to ensure their loyalty, these local leaders are going to be gifted with land. Okay, so fiefs or fiefdoms are going to be given to these vassals in exchange for their loyalty. And they're going to have peasants working this land for the nobles, and taxes are going to be collected and given back to the government, the Safavid government. Okay, what do we call this system of loyalty based on land? Feudalism, exactly right. I'm going to type that in the chat. Okay, feudalism. We've seen this in Europe. We see it in the Ottoman Empire. We see it in Russia. We see it in the Safavid Empire. Okay, giving land in order to ensure loyalty. In fact, after the Battle of Chalderon, they had to give the Qizilbash a lot of land in order to keep them loyal, because they're no longer fighting for the Shah because they believe he's Allah. Now they're just fighting because they can get something out of it. Okay, so we see feudalism and tributary systems emerge. But with this, the local Turks are going to see an increase in power. And that is going to threaten the Safavid bureaucracy. Okay, so y'all may remember when the Mongols took over this area. The Mongols were great at conquering, but not so great at administrating. And so they would rely on local leaders to administer for them. Okay, same thing's going to happen with the Safavid. As they start relying more and more on local leaders, their own influence is going to decline. Okay, so Shahs were relying on Turks, so they shift over to relying instead on Persians to kind of balance that out, but it's not going to be enough to stop the fall of the empire, particularly when it comes to how they treat the Sunni populations within this empire. Are we good so far? Okay. Can you see the text on this? Mm-hmm.
It's not like very.
Okay, do you want to move up, or do you want to just see it on your computer screen?
I can join.
Okay. All right, so the capital of the Ottoman Empire was what? Different empire, Ottoman Empire. What was the capital? Well, it used to be Constantinople until 1453. Then it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks and renamed Istanbul. Good, Elizabeth. Okay, the way I remember the capitals of these empires is I remember that Istanbul starts with an I, and Isfahan starts with an I. So the capitals of the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire both start with I's. Okay, also a similarity between the two capitals is that both capitals are going to be beautified. Okay, the Shahs and the Sultans, okay, the Sultans in the Ottoman Empire and the Shahs in the Safavid Empire are going to try to build elaborate infrastructure in order to show off their wealth and their power and to legitimize their rule. This is not the first time we've seen this. Okay, in the Byzantine Empire, Justinian the Great built the Hagia Sophia and the Hippodrome in order to awe and inspire by showing off his wealth, but also to show his connection to Eastern Orthodoxy with the building of the church. Okay, Ivan the Terrible in Russia built St. Basil's Cathedral to legitimize his rule through religion with Russian Orthodoxy. Louis XIV built the Palace of Versailles in order to awe and inspire. It didn't have anything to do with religion, okay, but it showed off his wealth and it showed off his power. So the same thing is going to be happening in Isfahan. Okay, so we see the building of the Ali Kipu Palace or Kwapu Palace. It's a written test. Okay, so I'm going to mispronounce quite a bit here. So again, we see the syncretism in architecture. And remember, the purpose of all of this beautification was to show off power and to legitimize rule, to legitimize that power. And so Isfahan is going to become well known for its markets, its royal mosque, its avenues, its courtyards. Okay, very, very fancy. However, what you'll notice about this capital is that it is landlocked. It does not have access to maritime routes. That is in contrast to Istanbul. Now, Istanbul had access to maritime trade. What two bodies of water was Istanbul touching? The Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. So we have the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. Both are big hubs for trade, particularly the Mediterranean. Okay, Isfahan is not going to have access to those maritime routes. Okay, because from period 1 to period 2, we saw a change over time in terms of the importance of trade routes. Not just the importance of trade routes, but which trade routes were being used. So in period 1, which is from 1250 to 1450, they primarily relied on land trade. Okay, what's a famous land route that you remember from period 1? The Silk Road, exactly right. Okay, now under the Mongols and the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road trade was popping. Okay, they had protected the trade, they punished anyone who stole, you were guaranteed to get from point A to point B, and so there was a lot of trade going on the Silk Road. But then we moved from period 1 into period 2, which is 1450 to 1750. Now we're not relying so much on land trade. Now we're relying on maritime trade. Okay, so like before, we have the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, what's another maritime trade route that features prominently in period 2? The Indian Ocean, exactly. Okay, remember that Portugal spent a lot of time and money trying to get to the Indian Ocean by going around Africa. And then finally, what other ocean became prominent during this time? The Atlantic Ocean, exactly right. Okay, so remember, they hadn't really used the Atlantic Ocean much because they didn't think that there was anything to the west until in 1492, Christopher Columbus fails upwards by accidentally landing in the New World. Okay, so you have the emergence of the Columbian Exchange. Isfahan doesn't have contact with that trade. Isfahan is landlocked. The Safavid Empire lacks a navy. Okay, the Ottoman Empire had a navy, but the Safavid Empire didn't. Okay, so being cut off from these main avenues of trade is going to do what economically to the Safavid? Is it going to help or hurt them? it's going to hurt them. And when a government can't make money off of trade or tribute, how else do they make money? Taxes, exactly right. So if they're not making enough money by exporting for trade or by collecting tribute, well, then they're going to collect more taxes. And typically people don't feel too good about having more taxes being collected. Okay, so you have increased tension internally, economically, but also you have increased tension religiously that is going to lead to revolution. A revolution that pretty much destroys the Safavid Empire. So back in 1514, it was hit really bad with the Battle of Chalderon, but it was down, not out. Okay, this revolution is going to be what ends the empire in 1722. So what had happened was the Shah at the time, Shah Hussein, was super, super strict about Shia Islam. He wanted everybody to be Shia, no Sunnis, no Sufis, no nothing else, okay, just Shia. And so he is going to institute some pretty severe laws. As a result of this, the Afghan Sunni Pashtuns, okay, these are Afghan tribesmen who are Sunni, they are going to rise up under their leader, Mahmud, which is different from Mahmud of Ghazni, okay? This is Mahmud of the Sunni Pashtuns. So Mahmud leads this army to Isfahan and sieges the city, okay? They don't get to capture it yet because the city hasn't surrendered. So they siege the city and they blockade it, meaning that they've blocked off anything going in or anything coming out. That includes food and supplies. And so once they siege the capital, the inhabitants of the capital start starving to death, eventually even going so far as to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. So the pressure against the Shah gets to be too great because remember, this is his city, it's where he lives. And so he is forced to surrender. And in that surrender, he abdicates his throne. Now, what does it mean to abdicate? To resign, to give up your throne. Exactly right. So he gives up his throne, he's executed, thousands of others are executed, and the Safavid Empire is no more. Now, Mahmud of the Sunni is going to declare himself the new Shah, the Shah of Persia, rather than the Safavid. And this is eventually going to result in the establishment of the Zand dynasty in 1760. Okay, so the Safavid Empire fell in 1722, only lasted about 2 centuries, and we know that there are a number of reasons for why it was so short-lived. The biggest reason being religious intolerance, as we see in this rebellion, but also geographically being cut off from maritime trade, while also being smack dab in the middle of 2 expanding empires, also didn't bode well for the longevity of this empire. Are there any questions about the Safavid? All right, then we have finished with the Safavid lecture. Now we're going to move on to the Mughal lecture.